My conversation today is with CTS Athlete and professional trail and ultrarunner for Adidas Terrex, Abby Hall. Abby is also a talented graphic designer, and if you have the second edition of Training Essentials for Ultrarunning by Jason Koop, you've seen her work because she is responsible for making it so beautiful. You can find Abby and her husband Cordis running around their home in Flagstaff, Arizona, or exploring the mountains from their van. Abby had a stellar 2021 race season, capping it off with a second place finish at the highly competitive UTMB's CCC. I wanted to have Abby on to talk to her about her relationship with setting big, audacious goals, like an unsupported fastest known time attempt on the John Muir Trail. That's 223 miles long, and how goals drive process and intention in her day-to-day life and training. Let's dive into our conversation and see what we can learn. Abby Hall, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much, Corinne Malcolm.
All the formalities. For those who don't know, I'm actually at the Hall's house right now. I'm sitting in their dining room. Abby's back in her office. So we've completely split the house in half for this interview, and I could not be more thrilled.
It's pretty great. Fortunately, I can't hear you echoing. So far, so good.
So far, so good. We'll get Cordis. You'll probably hear Cordis in the background here in a little bit. We'll just have the whole Hall family on. But for those who are listening who might not know you, might not know who you are or where you're from or your history, I'm just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about who you are and what you've been up to.
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a trail and ultra runner for Adidas Terrex, first of all, is maybe the context in which we're talking here today. And that's become a big part of my life the last, 5 years or so, especially the last few years. I'm kind of working backwards, but my husband Cordis and I recently moved to Flagstaff, Arizona. Prior to that, we were in Boulder, Colorado, which is really where I got into the sport. And prior to that, I grew up running track and cross country in school, and really never thought I was going to continue to have the sport play the role in my life that it is. So it's been an interesting journey for me of not a logical or obvious path leading me to where I am now, but I'm enjoying every minute of it. When we moved here, actually shortly before, I'd made the decision to kind of go more all in on my running as my job at the moment. But outside of that, I also do design work. And so that's been a career of mine that I've, done for the last 10 years alongside everything else. But I'm at a place now where I'm kind of picking and choosing what projects I'm taking on in a way that fits with running and helps me maintain the balance of priorities that's right for me at the moment.
Yeah, so for those of you who own the second edition of Training Essentials for Ultrarunning by one of our favorites, Jason Koop, this is the Abby Hall that we've both been shouting her name to the rooftops for, because she did all the beautiful graphic design and layout and formatting for that behemoth of a book. So she's very, very talented. So if you don't have the book yet, you should probably buy it. Maybe not for our writing, but for the beautiful graphics that Abby created for us. So
I do love how those turned out, and it was a really fun project to work on with y'all.
Yeah. But one of the main reason I think that you and I wanted to get on and record is that we've kind of been tossing this idea back and forth. It actually was spurred via an Instagram story that you posted, I believe, of a friend of yours who's a school teacher in San Francisco, or an acquaintance of yours who's a school teacher, who used a project that you did during the pandemic, showed a film from it to her students, and used it to kind of set up this idea of goal setting. And it was really cool. I think we both shed tears over the post that you were putting up. And so that's, kind of why we wanted to start this conversation. And I think what came out of that was this idea that setting goals can be really, really daunting. But from your very start in the sport of trail and ultra running, you've kind of been transfixed by a really big goal, being the JMT, or the Numapoyo, which is 223 miles in the Sierra. Massive, massive, daunting project. How, can you walk us through setting your sights on a goal like that? Because I think that's hard to conceptualize.
Absolutely. The John Muir Trail goal is truly what got me into the sport. I was living in Los Angeles at the time, went and climbed Mount Whitney, and was kind of curious, what's that trail that continues on the backside of Whitney? And, you're getting back, you're kind of intrigued by the trip you just had, and you start looking things up of like, what's the fastest time someone's done at this? And okay, it's called fastest known time. And oh my gosh, there's a whole lot of people who do this. And this is a crazy video or article. And I just started kind of falling down this fascinating rabbit hole of all things John Muir Trail. And I was at a place in my life where running was what I did after work every day, in the trails of Los Angeles and around Silver Lake. And I didn't have any community around running at the time. It was a solo thing I would go do at night, that I mainly loved because I had done it through college. And it was just something I loved that ran in the background. But I was at a place where I was really looking for more of a community around getting outside, around the outdoors, around running. And I think that really what's interesting about when I first came up with this goal of, oh my gosh, I want to set the fastest known time on the John Muir Trail. I think when I really look back at that, I was more curious about becoming the kind of person that would set the FKT on this than I was about actually attaining the time itself. I was at this place where I was just intrigued by, I remember listening to interviews with like Jen Shelton, talking about like her times out there and, just these horror stories and epics. And like, that was what I wanted. I just wanted to be thrown off the deep end into all things ultra running. And I think so looking back at that, it became, a huge driver in my life pursuing this. I decided to move because of it. I at first thought, okay, maybe I'll move to the Eastern Sierra. I ultimately landed on, I'm going to move to Boulder, Colorado. And, like the drive to find a community around those things being a big part of choosing Boulder. But, I did what any other no guidance, no coach, first time ultra runner would do, which is signed up for my first ultra in June, my second ultra in July, and went for the JMT in September. So, I was pretty eager. I was really eager and really hungry. And it should come across as no surprise to anyone listening to this that I had a total epic out there. I brought my early boyfriend at the time, now husband, Cordis, told him I'd buy his ticket to California if he came with me and helped me make it a supported go. And I bailed probably 35 or 40 miles in. So it was extremely short-lived. And I think, looking back largely, it was because the plan had no contingencies. It was plan A, FKT, or bust. The minute I was off pace, I was suddenly not making it to my support in time, not having enough food in time, not having sleeping gear in time. And so it was, it left me a tiny needle to thread. And I think was one of the first times that, actually, no, not one of the first times, because this happened plenty of times in high school and college with running as well. But one of the many times that running or a goal just totally broke my heart, left me totally blindsided. Oh my gosh. And it left me at this, crossroads of, okay, do I just kind of pretend this never happened and never talk about it and, tail between my legs, just, continue on quietly? Or do I really like lean into trying to figure out, well, what would it look like if I wanted to still become better at this? So it went from this very emotionally driven goal to becoming a little bit more tactical, and left me with this curiosity of what improving at these things might actually look like and what that path would look like.
Yeah, that truly sounds like trial by fire,
Mm-hmm.
right? Just like, or baptism by fire, just all in. And it's this very emotional, like, I'm doing this thing, I'm winning this thing, I'm running this distance. And having a goal that's so, I mean, it's a solid goal, but it doesn't seem like it's supported by process. And so I'm wondering how you, like, through that experience, or through, that experience and the culmination of all the experiences before that, how has that shifted your idea of like, okay, I've got this goal, but I need to establish support for the goal, be it process or values oriented thought processes? Like, what has that looked like? How has that been reshaped?
Well, so I think goals drive process, and maybe a better way of labeling it is kind of this idea of our personal evolution, right? I mean, and I say personal evolution because I think these goals have become really intertwined with my own evolution as a human being, whether it's working through ideas like confidence, feeling like I belong, working through fear, anxiety, being a fierce competitor, a fierce cheerleader of others. Those are all things that span far beyond running. And I think, sometimes we being like the collective we in our sport have this desire to definitely kind of try and divorce who we are as a person from, our athletic accomplishments. And I totally understand the idea behind that. But I think for me, running has been a really transformative driver of growth in those personal areas, myself, my relationship with myself, me as a friend, as a partner, my emotional growth. And so I'm really glad I've let it spur on growth in those areas of my life, because, not just limited to when I'm crossing a finish line or meeting a goal or not meeting a goal, because I think that the goal really, really drives process, and that best process really happens when we are showing up as our truest selves. So like it's becoming far beyond, like I look back at who I was as a person when I was going for that goal, and the things I've improved at. I've my workout splits aren't probably that much better. My volume might be a bit more, but I am a very transformed person in some of those areas I mentioned, confidence, fear, things like that. And that's where the growth occurs. And that's where also like the most true process lives, in my opinion.
Yeah, it seems like a chicken or the egg, right? Like, is it process is goals, goals is process, and it kind of goes around and around and around. And there's this idea that I think it's thrown around a lot. I see it on Instagram. I see it on people's, particularly from like messaging from athletes in general, is the idea that, process over outcome. And the
Mm-hmm.
idea being that if you're focusing on the process, I think there's emotions tied up in that, generally speaking, as opposed
Mm-hmm.
to like a very like rigid goal, that you're more likely to achieve that goal by doing all these little things. And
Um,
I think that's probably because it's more holistic
mm-hmm.
in general. And so when it comes to using these goals in like for like the way you look at it, using these goals to establish process,
Yeah.
I think sometimes that seems really, and once again, I'm using my favorite word. Anyone who's been listening to this podcast, my new favorite word is nebulous.
Mm-hmm.
Establishing process feels really nebulous. Like, what does that even look like? What does that even mean? So, as your goals are dictating that, like, how have you been able to take a step back
Mm-hmm.
and be like, okay, to reach these things,
Mm-hmm.
this is how I need to orient the process?
Yeah. I mean, I think the way I look at it is probably twofold. It's like equal parts vision and trust.
Okay.
So there definitely is this, large part of my brain that is always visualizing, and I mean that truly in a literal sense. Like I spend a lot of time on my runs visualizing not just like a goal, but even like how I want to carry myself, who I want to be, how I want to talk about running, and these things like that are a part of kind of my personal vision board, if you will, of like what I want to do in this sport. But that is nothing without a a very even keeled trust in this overarching process. And a lot of that for me has involved, people that I trust. So for me, like my coach, Jason Coop, but also like, bringing in people like teammates and PTs and, just strength coach and whatever other pieces make you a whole athlete, a whole person, those are the kind of pieces to me that like kind of even out this idea of, yeah, trusting the process, a process that's not just led by you and what you think your path there should be, but by some chosen experts that you want to bring around you. Um, I think I think that my kind of, original idea though that I spoke to of this first time with the JMT goal of trying to be the kind of person that would set this FKT, I think over time in the sport that goal, that way of phrasing it started to break down for me, because it wasn't serving me anymore, because it made me feel like I needed to be more like someone else. And it might have worked, I think, for getting me into the sport and having this very imaginative idea of what it meant to be this like epic ultra runner. But I, you know, I guess I alluded to it earlier, but finding a way to be yourself while pursuing your goals. For me, that's a huge part of just that process being actually embedded in your life, not this external layer. Um, and, I think a huge piece here too is how we let the outcome then impact the process. So, after a, whatever you want to call it, failure, misstep, somewhere in between, massive success, and you go back to your quote, day-to-day process, like how are you able to let an outcome speak back to your process? So I think we always talk about it, of like process leading into outcome, but how does an outcome impact our process? And being vulnerable is a big part of weaving in that circle of people you trust too.
Yeah, I think it's, outcome can totally derail you, or it can inspire or ignite something different in you, or shape, kind of the person that you become, or lead you to a more authentic version of yourself. And so I think what's really interesting is that the JMT was something that you went after very early in
Right.
your running with almost a fervor, and maybe not the clearest of kind of like mind in a way. But
Yeah.
then, pandemic happens, all of our racing goes away. We have an opportunity to do some really cool things.
Mm.
All of a sudden, the JMT's back on your radar. And it's this, in a lot of ways, I think it's fair to say that you've evolved as a person and as a runner in between those two attempts. What did that look like going into round two? Like both, the good and the bad, and getting out there and
Yeah.
experiencing the whole thing this time around.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I definitely kind of upped the ante by choosing to go unsupported this time. So I thought, okay, well, if I couldn't complete it last time supported, I know this time I'll do it unsupported. I'll try it with a way heavier pack and try and do it all by myself. And actually, I do think that like idea of upping the ante was an interesting part of it. Like, just psychologically when I think of things that contributed to that second round. But anyways, yeah, I was able to complete it. I ultimately missed the unsupported fastest known time by a little bit, 6 hours, which sounds like a lot, but over 4+ days felt like, I
Very
put a
little.
time out there. Um, and I think for me, I mean, it was obviously finishing that was a huge milestone and accomplishment for me, in ways that I would classify primarily as this like emotional confidence, like able to kind of, yeah, just like it's very reflective of my relationship with self in a way that I have carried forward with me in some ways that since returning to racing, has been really helpful for me. And I think also by still ultimately not achieving that FKT, it continued to root this down as something I will continue to be returning to over the years. And it feels a bit like a mirror to me in that way. And I I think my first attempt was 4 years before the last. So I'm like, okay, if I go for it again in another couple of years, it's just like my college, it's like every 4 years I go check in and see where I'm at.
Try to graduate.
Yeah, yeah. But I think for me, what was really interesting about that project is that I did not get the FKT, yet it resonated with people far more than other FKTs or other accomplishments I've done. And I think that it is this idea of pursuing a long-term goal that resonates with people and feeling like, you know, that idea of returning to something that has previously been a failure, uh, I think is interesting. I think is inspiring, and I'm glad to see it resonated with people. Like the teacher on Instagram who tagged me in that. I did not know them, but they
That's so
posted that, and since then I've had a couple other teachers messaging me. Oh yeah, I totally used that idea too, and came up with a worksheet for my students. And I think I'm going to go talk to some of these classes because I think it's especially like in this instance with young people. I think a really interesting thing to see. Okay, what does it look like when you miss a goal and you choose to return to it, and why does that matter? And I think it clearly hits a chord with a lot of people. So that's been really interesting to see.
Yeah, I watched the film. It was very auspicious timing, I guess. I my own FKT had been derailed over and over again, and I was like, it's not going to happen. And then your film came out, and I watched it, and I was like, we're going to make it happen, even if I miss it. We will
Yeah.
go. I just need to go run around this giant circle and see what happens. And so I think, yeah, it did. It resonated with lots of people. And I think one of the cool things coming out of it, as you mentioned, is that you didn't you didn't technically hit this goal of breaking the FKT. You came very, very close. And that, you know, as we said, that outcome could derail you or could define you. And instead, I think coming out of that and into a race season, what
Mhm.
I noticed in your confidence and in your running was that you kind of what you had to do out there as far as like push yourself and kind of go up against this unknown. I think that's you've been able to translate that
Mhm.
into your running. And I'm wondering if you can speak to that a little bit about like kind of lessons learned from that experience and how you've been able to translate that to more traditional goals, i.e., getting on a
Mhm.
start line and trying to be the first one to the other end of the race.
Absolutely. I think for me, a huge driving factor that came out of that and into my season was risk taking. And I think doing something that long by myself, knowing I could continue to take care of myself and put one foot in front of the other, um, I think establishes this baseline of, okay, I know I can do some hard, long things and I can keep putting one foot in front of the other, even when it's very, very hard. And I tested at the time my outermost limit of that. And I think returning to racing has felt, like I'm able to take on a lot more risk. And that's actually one thing, Coop talks about in his book with goal setting of, how much risk are you willing to take on, when determining kind of the achievability of your goals. And I think like CCC was a good example of that. Like I took on a lot of risk with how I wanted to race that. And, I wanted to be in the top 3 there and ultimately finish second. But my goal was kind of, okay, I want to arrive halfway-ish through in Champe Lac, unsure if I can continue to pull this off and be riding the line that closely. And I don't know if I would have raced with that kind of tactic prior to taking something on like Numpoyo JMT. So I think that that's been a big driving force is just realizing, okay, I can go into a race, take some risk, and maybe fall short and still get across that finish line, hopefully. Um, or I can risk and maybe I actually pull it off. So that's been a cool thing to kind of realize. Yeah.
I think it's super inspiring. I'm definitely a well, I'll just outlast everyone
Mhm.
style of racer, and it's scary to lay it out there like that. And I think it's really cool that JMT, something so different from that,
Yeah.
was able to elicit and kind of provoke that change in how you see yourself as a runner and as a person. I think
Definitely.
goal setting is really different. Not necessarily really different. I think goal setting for those big projects, or as you said, almost like a lifestyle goal, um, or at least what was a lifestyle goal,
Yeah.
is very different than what most of us look at traditionally for a season.
Mhm.
And so you're looking at a pretty traditional season. You know, you're going to open it up here in just a couple weeks at Trans Gran Canaria, which is super exciting. I'm wondering how you've approached this season, both personally and with your coach, for establishing those goals and then establishing the process around which you are going to kind of act in your day to day in order to hopefully accomplish another really really fantastic year of racing.
Yeah, I think my race plans are a lot more meticulous than they used to be in terms of pacing and splits. And that was one thing that we tried at CCC that was new for me was coming up with very specific splits I was trying to hit during the race. And fortunately for CCC, I had the luxury of being able to be out there early ahead of time and really establish, okay, what are those splits for me personally. But I think that's one style I'm going to be bringing to like more of my races this year. And I think that partially comes from like when I think about risk, like alternatively, like last year I ran Western States and I didn't take a lot of risks in that race. And for me, that was kind of a reminder of that tactic that I chose to bring to CCC. I think like say I went into Western States feeling like I was expecting things out of the field. I was expecting big blow ups. I was expecting this. And I think it's becoming, I think the competition density is such now that that's maybe becoming kind of a dated way of a race looking. People are actually just putting together really aggressive, fantastic races start to finish. And to try and hang with that requires, laying out all the cards early. And so I think that that's definitely affected my personal strategy, that there's not this waiting on seeing how the field shakes out or waiting where I'm stacking up, comparing with others. It really is coming up with what my personal, very specific race plan is going to be and holding on tight. So I think I'll be continuing to focus on that this year. And I think returning to CCC, like similar to returning to Numapoyo, it's like it feels like a vulnerable thing to return to a place that means a lot to you. And I definitely am someone who is like rooted lifelong as a deep perfectionist, and so I think it requires a lot of letting go of my perfectionist tendencies to return to a place that's really significant to me, and trying some new things, hoping to improve on some things, but knowing I may fall short in certain areas, um, and being okay with the differences from year to year. And that's like, I think, definitely has been testing my vulnerability and things as I think about returning there this year. So that's something I'm excited to kind of work through, speaking to that like emotional, personal life part of it.
Yeah, I mean that I've been speaking with a lot of people about this recently on many platforms about this, about comparison,
Mm-hmm.
right? I just talked to Neil Palace about that as kind of part of this like psychological flexibility thing, that
Mm-hmm.
comparison is very prevalent in all of our lives, and that is comparison to others, but it's also comparison to yourself, to past self, to future self, to the last set of intervals you did on that same trail, to that
Right.
race that you've run before. And I'm wondering, how have you been looking at comparison in
Mm-hmm.
your life, and trying to hopefully mitigate comparison when it comes to both the training sessions
Yeah.
during your week, but also when it comes to returning to a race, like actually returning to Transgran Canaria. You've
Yeah.
been there before too. Like, what is like how are you evaluating comparison so that it doesn't hinder you? Because I think comparison can shut us down in a big way.
Yeah. Absolutely. I think for me, being present and thinking about the idea of presence has been a really big part of this. And approaching, knowing that while I might be returning to the same race, the path there is different every time is kind of a way I've been thinking of it. In the same way that when we go run a trail, like the conditions are always different. The exact footing we take is a little bit different. Like I like thinking of it that way. I'm someone who thinks a lot in metaphor, so this is a helpful visual for me. And I think, yeah, but I think presence is a really big part of that, because I really think that I don't know. I think presence has a way of kind of setting this foundation for our future, and like how we approach moment to moment really sets the tone for what we're building towards. And I think believing that has been a way of kind of tethering my mind from not only going too far in the future but also looking too far behind me as well. And so that's been something I've definitely been placing an emphasis on. So, a perfect example of this is, place you and I went yesterday for a workout. Like I had a crappy workout there last week, went back yesterday and had a better workout. And, I might have another crappy one there next week. And it's, by not getting too caught up in what's come before or what's still to come, I think allows me to kind of wring my best self out of each moment. But it definitely requires a lot of mind practice to do so. And that's something I'm very much trying to actively cultivate, and kind of reading up on right now. Like I'm reading this book that I highly recommend to anyone interested in anything we're talking about here, The Practice of Groundedness by Brad Stolberg. And it's like kind of one of those books that I can't get through more than a half dozen pages without like just like scribbling things and writing notes in my phone, because it's yeah, just kind of speaking to this very idea of how groundedness, impacts our future.
Yeah, it's a book that is on my bedside table at home, and a book that I'm really enjoying. I like to read like 4 or 5 books at a time. I'm terrible. I never get through things because I'm always reading something else, but it's really, really good. And he talks a lot about what I talked with Neil Palace about 2 weeks ago, with that kind of the ACT or ACT therapy, kind of with acceptance and commitment, and
Yeah.
comparison and psychological flexibility. So lots of things to dive into
Mhm.
there if people are interested in that. I think something interesting, and this kind of I think speaks to both comparison, but also like I've gotten to spend a lot of time with you. I've got a lot of insider knowledge on Abbey Hall, but not dirt, just insider knowledge. There's no dirt on the halls. They're just wonderful. But one thing I've admired being in training camps with you, being at races with you, being in your home here in Flagstaff is that the way you approach day to day, both training and life and fueling and yoga and everything is just, it seems that it comes with such intentionality. And I'm wondering if this is something that is just inherent to your perfectionism
Mhm.
or if it's something that you've actively cultivated
Mhm.
over the last, decade.
I think I probably a lot of that might be accidental. um, but first of all, thank you. But yeah, I think a lot of that might be partially accidental, partially related to how I think of things in very emotional terms. So I do have a propensity for being very emotionally attached to my goals, for better or worse. And I think a big byproduct of that is, like like I mentioned earlier, I'm constantly visualizing what, like what I want my life to look like, what I want my days to look like, how I want to feel in certain moments. So it's not just like visualizing an outcome, but visualizing, how I want to be able to carry myself or how I want to be able to, you know, work through a challenge. And so I think that spending a lot of time visualizing has maybe connected made my day-to-day feel more intentional, feel that connection to my goals. But I think like the tendency there is for it to all sound very future minded. And I think like the terms, success and failure and goals don't quite capture it all for me. Because ultimately, I've probably had a couple races or goals or whatever that have been total failures, and a couple that have been like total successes. Most of the time it's somewhere in between. So learning to approach that in between area with um, a sense of self love and some grace and also some drive to figure out how I want to steer things forward from there is kind of you know um, I don't know, just a way of thinking about it that I think has added some purpose to my day to day and how I choose to like create habits around navigating that gray area, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I've in talking with lots of athletes and coaches and humans, it seems that like many of our greatest strengths are also our greatest weaknesses. Like the things that make you thrive and succeed, or find success can also be your ultimate like, downfall as well. That can be competitiveness, that can be, living in that gray, whatever it is. I'm wondering, have you noticed that duality in
Mhm.
that, as far as like, this is my strength, but I need to like be cognizant of how it can be, too much too often.
Totally. I mean, I think a huge example of that, one thing Coop talks about in, with goal setting is this idea of I want is not really part of an outcome. And I, that's something I have had to self course correct on so many times because I think for so many of us, a goal comes about because we want a certain result. And just the way it's ultimately set up, I think creates this result minded outlook from the get go. And so breaking free from that a little bit and coming up with a blend of process and outcome goals that support a long term vision has been a helpful way of me properly channeling my emotional attachments to both goals and outcomes. So, I think early on in the sport, my desire for results was a lot greater than my ability to be patient and present with where I was actually at as an athlete. And so, yeah, I think a big thing has been kind of, you know, not only properly coming up with and structuring goals, but also coming up with a lot of patience in between, because there's ultimately it's ultimately mostly comprised of various plateaus, and there's not these huge leaps that we think there will be. It's really series of small actions and habits and things that build on each other over long periods of time and consistency. So yeah.
Yeah. I feel like my version of that is I lean into like just the knowledge that I'm checking the boxes. Like that's how I default. I'm like, okay, I've got this big goal. Well, the little goal is like just doing the little things, like kind of check, check, check. I'm a list person. I've got my list. I've got my planner back in a room back there, and I check all my little things off. I make lists every day.
I saw your plan.
Um,
It's
yeah, I know it's adorable. It's pink.
cute.
But I'm wondering, what does that look like in practice for you? Because it does feel like this, like
Mhm.
yours feels, you're okay. I'm a scientist
Mhm.
and you're an art person,
Mhm. Mhm.
right? You just like bleed creativity. How does, so I default to, checking the boxes, my Excel doc, whatever it might be. What does that look like in practice for you day to day, as far as being able to course correct when you need to, or get through what you need to?
Yeah, I do a lot of writing, just personally, kind of journaling. And I think that's been a huge part of kind of just seeing where my internal state is at. And also kind of maybe sharing those things too with, like with Cordis or with someone I'm running with or with Coop, and kind of testing these ways I'm thinking about something and seeing, kind of how that matches up with my intention going into something. And I think that for me, like my internal state and my emotional state feels like a metric that I might read like my CTL and Training Peaks, where my internal life and how I'm arriving at a start line in mind and spirit is something that I'm really cognizant of. And like this year, I know kind of certain gaps that I need to work through personally before I'm arriving at starting lines. And it's things, like managing fear of blowing up Trans Gran Canaria again, or how I manage in a field of like amazing, like a deep field of amazing women, like how, like, those are things that I'm constantly thinking of, just as much as I am kind of measuring metrics of my workouts and where I might be on a physical performance level. And so thinking of it for me that way has um, been freeing. And I think I have kind of goals in both departments, so to speak, but they also speak to each other.
Yeah, I like that. I think journaling is a I know often overlooked form of list of, just like checking in with yourself. I've encouraged a lot of athletes now actually to, we add a note to the end of the week, and it's their weekend note, and it's for them, and I'll go in there and read it if they want me to, and it's for them to kind of just evaluate their week
I
or
love
talk
that.
about their week, and it's always there for them, and it gives them a place to have it with all their training. And I think that's been a really effective way to kind of just like check in with themselves. So journaling, yes, more journaling for everyone.
I agree.
um, but I guess one of my final questions, I think, is this reflection on the pandemic and the reflection on this moment of pause, this pause that led to a lot of really cool things for many of us, a lot of big breakthroughs for
Mhm.
many of us. And I'm wondering, you know, that was a moment to reflect. And a lot of people questioned their why. Why do I race? Why do I run? Why do I do this? And I'm wondering, kind of reflecting on your career up to this point, your entry into running to who you are now. How has that why changed and grown with you as a person?
I think when I started off in the sport, my why was very much tied to, proving to myself that I could actually do these things that I'd wondered my whole life if I could do, and having gritty experiences and big journeys, and being part of this cool club of people that I looked up to and read about called Ultrarunners. Um, and I think over time that's shifted very much to celebrating who the kind of pursuit of these things has and is shaping me into being, and then in turn sharing that notion of self-love and journey with the self with other people. I think that's been a really freeing thing for me to realize, is that, like sports totally break us down and make us totally vulnerable. And what it reveals is ultimately an already really good thing, who we are by getting to these start lines, and being vulnerable enough to try something is a beautiful thing and worth celebrating.
I love that. I do think that you want to get to know someone. You want to know their default setting. It's to like see them 80 miles deep
Mhm.
into something or 120 miles deep into something, because it does. It makes us vulnerable. It exposes all of those strengths and weaknesses. So I think that our sport is very, very beautiful in that way, that we have this opportunity
And
to
that's what
do
makes
that.
our community so cool too. That's like what the glue of our community is in so many ways. So that community that first appealed to me so much, I think the way we all support one another in our lows is what makes that community special and worth trying to be a part of.
Yeah.
Trying to
Yeah.
be a part of.
Yeah.
Like I'm
Trying. We're actively trying. Yeah. So if you're a cyclist listening to this because you normally listen to Adam Pulford's podcast on the other weeks, become an ultra runner. It's a really good time. It's a really good time.
We'll
Um,
let you in, we promise.
we promise it's totally fine. We eat snacks in the woods. It's very fun.
Yeah, great.
We cry sometimes on the trail. It's
A
totally
lot.
normal.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you kind of some summary questions that I like to ask everyone. I think it's just kind of cool to collect this thing at the end of every episode. And you've already alluded to Brad Stulberg's
Yeah.
book on groundedness, which I think is an excellent reference for people. I'll link it in the show notes. But is there anything else that you've read, watched, or listened to recently that you think our audience who have hopefully enjoyed this conversation would find meaning in?
Um, Practice of Groundedness is definitely a big one, and that's the main book I'm reading right now. I would, in addition, say we just watched a nice documentary on Netflix called The River Runner, and that was a really interesting watch about a whitewater kayakers, return to sport after some serious health problems, and seeing how he navigated things like vulnerability and reframing success, was something I found really admirable. And I also just love watching other, maybe you could use this word, other niche sports, watching someone else's world of epic things. There's also just some beautiful outdoor shots in it of insane rivers that they're running. So it's a good watch.
Of insane, scary rivers, I'm sure. There's a lot of fear wrapped up in that sport. I think they've got some interesting psychology
Yeah.
that runs through their sport that we could probably bring in to
Yeah.
ultra running. This is one of my favorite questions that I get to ask people, and it's kind of a reflection of where you are now versus where you were when you got into the sport. And so I'm wondering if there's something that you know now that you wish that early ultra Abby, or even Abby from before 2020 JMT Nomapoyo, like
Mhm.
that you wish that, like, now you know this, you wish you could go back and tell that version of Abby, like, hey, this is what you need to know.
I think a big one would be early on in the sport, and this is still something I'm constantly trying to work through. I think it can be so easy for me to see failures as these parameters of how successful we can be, of kind of these bumpers of, okay, I failed, okay, I've had a few rough 100 milers, so hundreds aren't for me. Okay, so that means this is what I'm left with to be good at. And that's just not how it works. I think I think that there's so many people that are capable of wildly successful things that often just maybe aren't vulnerable enough or patient enough to stick with something through multiple failures in a row. And that's something that I always love when I see someone do. And I think it's something that's so rewarding in our sport to watch, is knowing when someone struggled with something repeated times, and then they finally get that finish in, or they finally, are able to perform to their potential. And so, yeah, I think just not seeing those missteps or failures as these parameters that they feel like, these blockades they might feel like in the moment, um, is something that I would go shake my younger self's shoulders and say, you know, yeah, I think that, yeah, just kind of back to that idea of patience. There's, these big plateaus, and just being patient enough to stick with those plateaus is such a huge part of it.
Yeah, someone recently, maybe this is the episode with Neil as well. Someone will tell me if I'm wrong. Was that they're not plateaus; they're false summits. Okay,
Mm,
so you're going to be there for a little bit, but it's a false summit. You're gonna get over the top of it eventually
right.
and be so happy.
Right. And like we might feel like we're in this plateau or fall summit in the day to day, many days in a row, but ultimately still can be growing in the big picture. Growth isn't linear. So that's something that, yeah, is a freeing, beautiful thing to remember as well.
Yeah, super, super freeing. So, if people are super intrigued with what you're up to, with also the film that got put out, where can people find you if they want to learn more about you or your running or what you're up to next?
Yeah, you can check out what I'm up to day to day on Instagram. I'm pretty active on there. My handle is abby.k.hall. And then my husband Cordis and I repurposed our old wedding website into a blog, abbyandcordis.com, all spelled out. Cordis is Cordis. And yeah, we post some blog posts in there from time to time, as well as like YouTube videos and things like that that we'll sometimes link in there. So there's a few different mediums we've got chosen. But I think if you go to my Instagram, I think I've got a link in my bio to the Numapoyo video that we've talked about a couple times in this episode.
Yeah, and we'll link it in the show notes. It's beautifully done. You're going to be inspired to go chase something huge after watching it. So we'll get that linked in the show notes. Abby, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure.
Thank you. I really enjoyed being on here. Thank you.
Yay, let's go run.
Yay.